Hello. These are the readings and the commentary and maybe a little homily for September 17th, 2017, the 24th Sunday of the year. The first reading is from chapter 27 of the book of Sirach. Wrath and anger are hateful things, yet the sinner hugs them tight. The vengeful will suffer Yahweh's vengeance, for he remembers their sins in detail. Forgive your neighbor's injustice. Then when you pray, your own sins will be forgiven. Could anyone nourish anger against another and expect healing from Yahweh? Could anyone refuse mercy to another like himself? Can he seek pardon for his own sins? If one who is but flesh cherishes wrath, who will forgive his sins? Remember your last days. Set enmity aside. Remember death and decay, and cease from sin. Think of the commandments. Hate not your neighbor. Remember the Most High's covenant, and overlook faults. The word of the Lord. The second reading is a rather short one from chapter 14 of Romans, but one of the most powerful readings in the entire Bible, especially for us Christians. Paul says, "Brothers and sisters, none of us lives for oneself, and no one dies for oneself. For if we live for the Lord. And if we die for the Lord. So then, whether we live or die, we are the Lord's. For this is why Christ died and came to life, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living." The word of the Lord. The gospel is that one we're very familiar with, of the two people who owe debts and how God forgives one, and a huge one, and we don't forgive even small debts that people have toward us. It's a reading from the Gospel according to Matthew. Peter approached Jesus and asked, "Lord, if my brother sins against me, how often must I forgive? As many as 7 times?" Jesus answered, "I say to you, not 7 times, but 77 times. That is why the kingdom of heaven may be likened to a king who decided to settle accounts with his servants. When he began the accounting, a debtor was brought before him who owed him a large amount. Since he had no way of paying it back, his master ordered him to be sold along with his wife, his children, and all his property in payment of the debt. At that the servant fell down, did him homage, and said, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay you back in full.' Moved with compassion, the master of that servant let him go and forgave him the loan. When that servant had left, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him a much smaller amount. He seized him and started to choke him, demanding, 'Pay back what you owe.' Falling to his knees, his fellow servant begged him, 'Be patient with me, and I will pay you back.' But he refused. Instead, he had the fellow servant put in prison until he paid back the debt. Now when his fellow servants saw what had happened, they were more deeply disturbed, and went to their master and reported the whole affair. His master summoned him and said, 'You wicked servant, I forgave you your entire debt because you begged me to. Should you not have had pity on your fellow servant, as I have pity on you?' Then in anger, his master handed him over to the torturers until he should pay back the whole debt. So will my heavenly Father do to you, unless each of you forgives your brother and sister from your heart." The Gospel of the Lord. I mentioned in the commentary this week that there's a very interesting exchange in Genesis 39, something that we kind of overlook, yet at the time it was written, probably about 1,000 years before the time of Jesus, it was rather revolutionary. Remember in chapter 39, Joseph is sold into slavery into Egypt by his brothers, and he's sold to an Egyptian who's a house servant, I guess he becomes. And the problem is, Joseph is a rather good-looking person. His master's wife looks lustfully after him or at him, and constantly tries to get him to do evil things with her. And in chapter 39, she finally gets him alone, insists that he lie with her, and he says no. Now, it would make sense he wouldn't lie with her, simply out of the fact that, as he says, my master trusts me. He gives me permission to engage in any actions here except to have intercourse with you. And so, therefore, I'm not going to do it. But then he adds something. How could I do this thing, he says, and stand condemned before God? Now, please, 3,000 years ago, an awful lot of religions simply believed that nothing we did here affected our relationship with God unless it had to do with offering sacrifices or going to shrines or temples on special days and offering prayers. God really was not concerned with what you did in your everyday life. And one of the unique things of Judaism was this belief that God is concerned about everything you do in life. That's why your relationships with those around you become a key element in how God regards your life and regards you in judgment of that life. When Sirach stresses, the same thing Jesus stresses, that we ought to be forgiving people, they both work off of the premise that we should forgive others because God's already forgiven us. And if we don't see the great debt that God has wiped out of our lives, and then latch on to other people's debts, or resent things they've done to us, or hold somebody in contempt because, well, I remember 20 years ago they said this or they did that, that we're not at all following the pattern God set in our life by forgiving us. It's one of those principles that forgiveness is what Christians and Jews do. It makes them the people of God by the fact they do forgive. Now, when Peter asked Jesus in that gospel account, should I forgive my brother or sister 7 times? He's being very generous. A lot of people would not even forgive 1 time. And Jesus goes back to Genesis again, to that famous taunt of Lamech, who is one of the descendants of Adam and Eve, one of the early descendants, who says, if somebody hits me, I hit him back 7 times, and I'll avenge myself 77 times on anybody who does anything against me. Jesus says that he expects his followers to reverse that taunt of Lamech. They don't take revenge 77 times, they forgive 77 times. That's why that second reading, the reading of Paul from Romans, is so important, because he stresses we live our lives for the sake of other people throughout those lives. We don't live our lives just for ourselves. And that's one of the difficulties, is realizing how our lives affect other people. We don't live in a vacuum. What we do, what we think, what we plot, what we plan, always has, reverberations in those around us. Even those we don't see around us are affected by our behavior. That's why we always have to be conscious. We have to have a level of consciousness to see the effects that we engender on other people. I mentioned in the commentary, probably when all of us were little kids, 2, 3 years old, our parents did something to discipline us, and we yelled, "I hate you," to them. And most probably they just laughed and walked away. It's quite different if we tell our parents we hate them when we're 3 years old, over and against telling them we hate them when we're 30 years old. Because at that point of our life, that consciousness level of the effects of our actions or our words on other people should have gotten much, much more deep. And the deeper it gets, the more we realize the implications. Jesus of Nazareth basically approaches people living lives, ordinary lives. He didn't talk to priests or nuns or cloistered people. He talked to ordinary individuals living ordinary family lives. And he stressed the fact you should be conscious of how your life affects those people around you. The older you get, the deeper you go into your faith. The more that level should deepen enough that you would be able to see effects that somebody just living on the surface of life would totally ignore. That's why this weekend, for the liturgies and the 3 liturgical readings that we experience, we should be actually examining our conscience on how well we see how our lives affect others. We hope they affect them for good, which is what Jesus emphasized. Very often, when we don't realize how they affect people, they're probably affecting them for evil or hassle in their lives. And so, back again to that first reading from Sirach and that third reading from Matthew, we are people who have been forgiven. The older we get, the more we should appreciate how God has forgiven us, which means the older we get, the more we should be tenderly forgiving of people around us. Thank you very much.